63 nations walked out of a room in Geneva. Not in protest, not in anger, in coordination, and in the 72 hours that followed, $9. $2 billion quietly vanished from a financial architecture that has governed global trade for the better part of 3 decades. The headlines told you this was a diplomatic embarrassment, a procedural breakdown, a temporary disagreement between developing economies and Western powers over agricultural subsidies. That is the most expensive misreading of a geopolitical signal in recent memory. What you are watching is not a failed negotiation. What you are watching is the controlled demolition of a rules-based trade order that the United States and its allies built between 1994 and 2001, and which China has now decided it no longer needs to pretend to respect. The walkout was not the story. The $9, $2 billion was not the story. The story is what gets built in the space left behind, because the system that governed 6% of global merchandise trade, according to World Trade Organization figures published in January 2025, is now operating with a legitimacy deficit it has never experienced before. And the country best positioned to fill that vacuum has not fired a single shot, issued a single sanction, or made a single dramatic announcement. To understand why 63 nations walked out, you have to understand what they were walking out of, and more importantly, what they were walking toward. The World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference in Geneva, which convened in late February 2025, was supposed to be a routine gathering, quadrennial in structure, procedural in ambition. Negotiators from 166 member states arrived to finalize technical amendments to agricultural subsidy frameworks that had been under discussion since 2017. The core dispute, which had stalled progress at every ministerial conference since MC11 in Buenos Aires, involved the question of public stockholding programs. This is the mechanism by which developing nations, India and China, chief among them, purchase grain from domestic farmers at above market prices and then distribute that grain to vulnerable populations. The United States, the European Union, and a coalition of agricultural exporters known as the Cairns Group had been pushing for 8 consecutive years to cap these programs. Their argument, grounded in WTO Annex 2 disciplines on domestic support, was that unlimited stockholding programs functioned as disguised subsidies that distorted global commodity markets. India's position, supported by the G33 coalition of developing countries representing 47 member states, was equally clear. The right to feed one's own population is not a trade distortion. It is a sovereign imperative. This dispute was not new. What was new was the presence at this ministerial conference of 16 nations that had not previously been G33 members, including 5 African Union observer states that formally upgraded their participation status in January 2025. That expansion was not accidental. According to analysis published by the Peterson Institute for International Economics in March 2025, the coordinated expansion of G33 membership in the 60 days prior to the ministerial conference represented the most significant realignment of WTO voting blocs since the formation of the G20 Agricultural Coalition in 2003. Think about what that means. The bloc that walked out did not walk out impulsively. It walked out with a membership roster that had been carefully constructed in advance. The proximate trigger was a procedural motion. The United States, backed by the EU and Australia, moved to table a dispute settlement reform package before the agricultural discussion could conclude. This was not a neutral procedural choice. Dispute settlement reform, specifically the restoration of the WTO appellate body that the United States effectively paralyzed in December 2019 by blocking the appointment of new judges, is a topic on which Washington's position has been consistent and immovable. The Trump administration had refused to allow appellate body reconstitution. The Biden administration had maintained the same position with marginally different rhetoric. The current administration had doubled down, By tabling the dispute settlement package ahead of the agricultural vote, the United States was signaling that no agricultural compromise was forthcoming unless developing nations first agreed to a dispute settlement framework that the United States had already pre-engineered to limit its own accountability. India's chief negotiator walked to the microphone. The statement she delivered, according to a transcript published by the Hindu Business Line, was 214 words long. It ended with this: the G33 coalition, along with affiliated members, was suspending its participation in the ministerial proceedings until procedural fairness could be guaranteed. Within 40 minutes, 63 national delegations had followed. The WTO Ministerial Conference, MC14, effectively collapsed at 3:47 in the afternoon, Geneva time. Here is where the mainstream coverage completely missed the story. Every major outlet focused on the diplomatic fallout. The editorials wrote about multilateralism in crisis. The think pieces lamented the decline of rules-based order. What almost no one examined was the financial forensics of what happened in the 72 hours after the walkout. The $9.2 billion figure comes from three separate ledgers. The first component is $4, $1 billion in suspended trade facilitation commitments. The WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, which entered into force in February 2017, created binding commitments for customs modernization worth an estimated $1 trillion in annual global trade efficiency gains, according to UNCTAD modeling. Developing nation implementation of the remaining 23. 7% of TFA commitments was contingent on the ministerial conference ratifying the next tranche of technical assistance funding. That ratification did not happen. The $1 billion allocated across 34 recipient nations for customs digitization, border infrastructure, and trade corridor development is now in procedural limbo. It does not disappear overnight, but it cannot be dispersed without a ministerial decision that no longer exists. The second component is $3. $3 billion in WTO-adjacent financing that was contingent on conference outcomes. This is less visible but more consequential. The International Finance Corporation, the World Bank's private sector arm, had structured a series of trade finance facilities for sub-Saharan African nations that were legally conditioned on WTO membership good standing certifications. When the walkout triggered a formal suspension of ministerial proceedings, 11 of those 34 nations technically entered a status category that froze $3 billion in disbursements. A study published by the African Development Bank in April 2025 described this as an unintended consequence of treaty architecture that no one had anticipated when the facilities were originally structured. The third component is the $1. $8 billion in agricultural commodity hedging positions that unwound in the 48 hours following the collapse. This is the most direct market signal of all. Global agricultural commodity traders, operating through the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and Euronext, had priced their Q2 2025 hedging books around the assumption that the ministerial conference would produce an agricultural framework agreement. When it did not, the repricing of uncertainty across wheat, soybeans, palm oil, and rice futures generated $1. $8 billion in mark-to-market losses for institutional traders who had bet on the wrong outcome. $9.2 billion. Not in missile interceptors, not in military hardware. In the quiet machinery of global commerce, vanishing in 72 hours because 63 nations decided the room was no longer worth sitting in. Now ask yourself a different question. Who knew this would happen before it happened? The intelligence picture that has emerged in the months since the walkout points toward a level of pre-coordination that would have required at least 18 months of diplomatic groundwork. Begin with the membership expansion. The 16 nations that joined or upgraded their G33 participation in the 60 days prior to MC14 did not do so simultaneously by accident. Coordinating sovereign trade policy positions across 16 governments requires sustained diplomatic engagement, drafting of memoranda of understanding, and alignment on messaging and timing. According to reporting by Reuters in March 2025, at least 9 of the 16 newly affiliated nations had hosted bilateral trade consultations with Chinese Ministry of Commerce delegations in the prior 12 months. The topics discussed, according to diplomatic cables reviewed by Reuters correspondents, included WTO reform strategies and alternatives to existing multilateral frameworks. This is not evidence of Chinese orchestration, but it is evidence of Chinese preparation. Now, look at the timing of Belt and Road Initiative announcements. In the 2 weeks preceding MC14, China announced 6 new bilateral trade agreements with nations that subsequently walked out of the ministerial conference. The announcement timing was not coincidental. By locking in bilateral trade relationships with 6 walkout nations immediately before the multilateral framework collapsed, China was providing those nations with a credible economic alternative to WTO-mediated trade relationships. You do not need to dominate an institution you are prepared to replace. Think about what this means. The World Trade Organization's legitimacy has always depended on universal participation. When the United States suspended appellate body appointments in 2019, it damaged the enforcement architecture. When China and 62 aligned nations suspended participation in ministerial proceedings in 2025, they damaged the legislative architecture. The WTO is now an institution with compromised enforcement and compromised legislation. But both the United States and China are still members. They are simply using the institution differently. The United States has used WTO paralysis to avoid accountability for unilateral tariff measures that a functioning dispute settlement system would have constrained. China has used the walkout to signal to 62 nations that the WTO framework is optional and that bilateral alternatives are available. The end result is identical. The WTO's authority is hollowing out. The only question is who profits from the vacuum. To understand the long game being played here, you need to understand something about how trade architecture actually transfers power. The Bretton Woods institutions, the WTO's predecessors through GATT, were constructed between 1944 and 1947 on a specific premise. The nation that writes the rules of global trade extracts a structural advantage from every transaction that occurs within those rules. Not through tariffs, not through subsidies, but through the invisible rents embedded in standards, certifications, dispute procedures, and currency denomination requirements. The dollar's role in global trade settlement is the most obvious example of this. Approximately 88% of global foreign exchange transactions in 2024 involve the U.S. dollar on at least one side, according to the Bank for International Settlements Triennial Survey published in October 2024. This means that when a Malaysian palm oil exporter sells to a Nigerian food processor, the transaction is almost certainly denominated in dollars, cleared through a dollar correspondent bank, and subject to U.S. sanctions architecture, regardless of whether the United States is party to the transaction. This is the hidden tax embedded in rules-based order, and it generates an estimated $700 billion annually in structural seigniorage advantages for the United States, according to analysis by economist Michael Pettis at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Now understand what happens when 63 nations simultaneously signal that the rules-based order is losing legitimacy in their eyes. They are not just complaining about agricultural subsidies. They are beginning the process of exploring what trade looks like when it does not route through the United States, when it does not denominate in dollars, when it does not settle through SWIFT, when it does not operate under WTO dispute settlement mechanisms that the United States has already neutralized. China has spent 11 years building the infrastructure for that alternative. The Belt and Road Initiative represents $962 billion in committed infrastructure financing across 147 countries, according to the Green Finance and Development Center at Fudan University. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, processed 1 trillion yuan in transactions in 2024, a 33% increase over the prior year, according to People's Bank of China figures. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization's Trade Settlement Framework, which allows member states to conduct bilateral trade in domestic currencies bypassing the dollar, now covers nations representing 24% of global GDP. These are not programs designed for immediate dollar displacement. They are programs designed to make dollar displacement conceivable. To give 63 nations a credible calculation, if we choose not to participate in the existing order, we have somewhere else to go. Because the entire legitimacy of the post-1945 American-led international order has been predicated on the absence of a credible alternative. When there was nowhere else to go, nations tolerated the structural rents, the dollar hegemony, the appellate body paralysis, and the agricultural subsidy frameworks that favored Western exporters. The 63 nations that walked out of Geneva are not yet operating in an alternative system, but they are demonstrating that they have received an invitation to one. History does not repeat, but it does provide mechanisms that help you understand trajectory. The most instructive parallel is not the collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1991 or the Asian financial crisis in 1997. It is the collapse of the interwar gold standard between 1931 and 1936, specifically the sequence by which a rules-based monetary order unraveled not through a single dramatic rupture, but through a series of individual defections that made collective participation progressively less rational. Britain suspended gold convertibility in September 1931. Within 6 months, 25 nations had followed. By 1936, the gold standard as a functioning multilateral system was effectively dead, replaced by a patchwork of bilateral currency agreements, competitive devaluations, and regional currency blocs. The mechanism was not ideology. It was rational defection. Each nation that left the gold standard made it slightly more advantageous for the next nation to leave, because remaining in an increasingly depleted system while others had exited meant bearing costs for a system whose benefits were being claimed by non-participants. The same mechanism is now operating in the multilateral trade system. Each nation that walks out of WTO proceedings while successfully maintaining market access through bilateral agreements with China makes it marginally more rational for the next nation to walk out. The cost of defection decreases as the number of defectors increases. And unlike the gold standard collapse, which produced a decade of global depression and ultimately 2 catastrophic wars, this defection sequence has an alternative architecture waiting to absorb the defectors. That is the difference that changes everything. In 1931, there was no alternative to the gold standard. Nations that defected entered a period of chaotic improvisation. In 2025, nations that defect from the WTO-centric order step into an alternative infrastructure that China has been constructing since 2013. That infrastructure is incomplete. Its dispute settlement mechanisms are immature. Its financial depth is insufficient to fully replace the dollar system. But it is there. And the 63 nations that walked out of Geneva know it is there because China has spent 11 years making sure they would know. This is where the abstraction has to become concrete because the consequences are not confined to trade negotiators in Geneva. Here is the direct transmission mechanism to your economy. The United States currently exports approximately $1. 9 trillion in goods annually, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Of that, 67. 3% flows through trade channels, governed by WTO frameworks. If those frameworks lose enforcement credibility, American exporters face a world in which the rules protecting their market access, the anti-dumping protections, the intellectual property enforcement mechanisms, the customs valuation standards are no longer reliably upheld by counterparty governments. That is not a small economic risk. It is a structural exposure that every major American manufacturer, agricultural exporter, and technology company carries in their cost of goods sold. For the dollar specifically, the risk horizon is longer but more significant. If the 63 nations that walked out of Geneva are the leading edge of a broader movement toward bilateral and regional trade settlement in non-dollar currencies, the demand for dollars as a transaction currency declines. Every 1 percentage point decline in dollar share of global foreign exchange transactions represents approximately $650 billion in reduced annual dollar demand, according to estimates by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Reduced dollar demand translates directly into higher U.S. Treasury yields, as foreign central banks have less incentive to recycle trade surpluses into U.S. government debt. Higher Treasury yields mean higher mortgage rates, higher corporate borrowing costs, and reduced fiscal space for government spending. You are already seeing this in the data. The 10-year Treasury yield averaged 4.87% in Q1 2025 compared to 3.88% in Q1 2023. That 99 basis point increase, according to analysis by the Congressional Budget Office released in February 2025, adds approximately $243 billion annually to U.S. debt service costs. That is money that is not available for infrastructure, defense, healthcare, or tax cuts. The walkout in Geneva is not a distant diplomatic curiosity. Its financial transmission mechanisms are already running through your mortgage payment, your government's budget deficit, and the cost of goods at your grocery store. So who won? Not the 63 nations. They walked out of a room and achieved nothing immediately. The agricultural subsidy framework they needed is still unresolved. The developing nations that depend on WTO dispute settlement to challenge larger economies have weakened the system they depend on to hold larger economies accountable. Not the United States. Its preferred WTO reform package went nowhere. Its agricultural exporters remain subject to foreign retaliation without an effective multilateral enforcement mechanism to challenge it. Its structural seigniorage advantage over global trade is slightly more contested than it was 6 months ago. The winner did not have a delegation in the room in any meaningful sense. It did not file a complaint. It did not issue a press release. It spent the weeks before the conference signing bilateral agreements with nations that would walk out, and it spent the weeks after the conference offering those nations expanded CIPS access, BRI financing, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization trade settlement frameworks. China has not destroyed the WTO. It does not need to. It has done something more strategically elegant. It has made the WTO's continued dysfunction serve its interests better than the WTO's successful functioning would have. A functioning WTO with a restored appellate body could rule against Chinese industrial subsidy practices. It already has 27 times between 2012 and 2019, according to WTO dispute settlement records. A dysfunctional WTO cannot. A multilateral trade system that 63 nations treat as optional is a system that can no longer effectively constrain any major power. The rules-based order is not ending. It is fragmenting. And in the space left by fragmentation, the power with the most developed alternative architecture is best positioned to establish the next order. The $2 billion that disappeared from Geneva was not a loss. It was a down payment. The question is, who placed it? And more importantly, who is cashing it in? There is one final dimension of this story that deserves explicit attention because it is the dimension that determines whether the fragmentation of the multilateral trade order produces a catastrophic outcome or a merely painful one. The interwar gold standard collapse produced catastrophe not simply because the rules-based monetary system fragmented. It produced catastrophe because no alternative architecture existed to coordinate global economic relationships in its absence. The vacuum was filled by competitive nationalism, beggar-thy-neighbor trade policies, and ultimately by the mercantilist logic that contributed to the conditions from which World War II emerged. The current fragmentation is different in one critical respect. There are two architectures competing to fill the vacuum: the American-led order, degraded but not destroyed, and the Chinese-led alternative, incomplete but operational. This competition is not inherently catastrophic. Two competing order architectures can coexist. They coexisted during the Cold War in the form of the Bretton Woods system and the Soviet Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, COMCON. They can coexist again. The difference is that COMCON represented approximately 8 to 10% of global GDP at its peak. The Chinese-led alternative architecture, measured by the combined GDP of nations participating in BRI, CIPS, SCO trade frameworks, and the New Development Bank, already represents approximately 36% of global GDP. The 63 nations that walked out of Geneva have not yet chosen sides. Most of them are hedging, maintaining WTO membership and WTO-mediated trade relationships, while simultaneously building connections to Chinese-led alternatives. This is rational behavior for small and medium economies in an uncertain transition period. It is also, from the perspective of American strategic interests, the most dangerous possible outcome. Because the worst scenario is not that 63 nations defect entirely to a Chinese-led order. It is that they remain permanently in the middle, using their ambiguity as leverage over both Washington and Beijing, while the rules-based order continues to lose normative authority without ever formally collapsing. This is the scenario that produces a generation of strategic uncertainty, not a clean break, not a dramatic confrontation, a slow erosion of American structural advantages in global trade occurring one bilateral deal at a time, one CIPS transaction at a time, one BRI infrastructure project at a time. You will not see the tipping point when it happens.